When my children were younger, each of them spent a number of years learning violin, right here in this room actually, according to the Suzuki method, which means that at any given moment I can hum a number of variations of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, as well as Lightly Row, Song of the Wind, and O Come Little Children. Now the reason I can do this is that our teacher had these little practice charts that had 100 spaces in them, each ready to be filled with a sticker or a stamp or a star. The girls could fill out one of those charts by playing a song 100 times. It was a lot of twinkles. But the idea behind the charts really wasn't any different than a truth that many of us already know, that you need to practice a skill not once, not twice, but many, many times to master it. And at some point in time during your repetitions, memory or muscle memory takes over and creates a certain ease with which to accomplish your new skill. It becomes second nature, and you don't even really have to think about it. This is as true with a cartwheel on a beam or solving a mathematical equation or a perfect soccer shot on goal as it is with the seamlessly playing a tricky bit of music. Which makes me wonder, what about the human heart? Do our hearts have muscle memory? June 6th, a number of years ago, was a very special day for Maggie Hammond. Maggie had struggled with a variety of eating disorders and behavioral issues, and she'd been enrolled in the high school's program for at-risk students. She had missed months of high school, being in and out of the hospital, but in the program, she began to develop the relationships that turned things around. Teachers sent her letters of love and support when she was in a treatment center. They encouraged her, helped her to set goals, to complete her coursework. Speaking at graduation, Hammond shared, "What kept me motivated every day was kindness. Kindness from my teachers and my fellow students, and especially from my mother. Those who loved me when it was impossible for me to love myself." There she was, a girl heading down a path of self-destruction, but love changed everything. And then now she's speaking to her graduating class and heading to college this fall. In another instance, author Glennon Melton shares a story about her first experience at a middle school cross-country meet, cheering on her son. I loved this story because I've seen it played out at cross-country meets here around our town, out at Norridge Park. She described the finish line with, at first, just all the parents cheering as the first few runners, those fast ones, came racing towards the finish. But then she went on to talk about how those runners joined the throng, cheering the remainder along. So greater and greater and greater numbers were gathered, encouraging the slower runners, the ones that were huffing and puffing and sweating and just trying to get to the end. And she writes, when the last girl rounded the corner with 200 yards left, how all of her teammates ran out and joined hands and ran together with her across the finish line. What could have been a moment of defeat and humiliation experienced alone, but love changed everything, and instead it became a celebration of accomplishment. In our own church, one of our Family Promise guests shares this story. After a tornado had destroyed his home down south, he decided to bring his family back to the community that he was raised in, our own town of Cedar Rapids. But now suffering from some mobility issues and MS, it was difficult to find work, and pretty soon they were out of the last bit of savings they had brought with them and were imminently going to be out on the streets. But enter the Family Promise program instead, and as the father puts it, From the first moment, we were surrounded by people who cared about us, who asked us over dinner how the job search was going, who sat down and ate with us, who chatted with my kids about school, encouraged them in their studies. I was able to concentrate on finding work, he says, and in finding a place to stay. What could have been a family in a car with kids struggling to finish homework in the back seat, but love changed everything. And instead, it's a family in a home now, and kids on the honor roll. Our text for today opens with Jesus saying to the disciples, "If you love me, you will keep my commandments." And he is referring in no small part to his previous encouragement in this last dinner together with his disciples to love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another, Jesus says. Soon Jesus would no longer physically be with them as they had known him, and he was preparing them for life without his physical presence. And he was emphasizing to them how his followers were to continue his legacy through living a life that he had modeled for them, obeying this commandment to love one another. It is so important that throughout these chapters of Jesus' final discourse with his disciples, he returns to it again and again and again, at least once for every chapter. But this, however, will be no easy thing for the disciples to do. Even now, seated around the table, they are filled with confusion at his words and his actions. In the days to come, there will be fear and deep grief and a sense of hopelessness. And so in this moment, Jesus promises the Spirit's presence, an advocate to accompany them forever, to walk beside them. The Spirit would walk with them and guide them just the way he had walked with them and guided them. The Spirit would be with the disciples as Jesus was with them, an ever-present companion embodying Jesus' very presence. The Spirit indeed walks alongside us, accompanying us even in our most troubled moments. Paraclete, the word translated as advocate in our reading today, more literally means the one called alongside. The Spirit is called alongside us, and we are called to walk alongside each other. So here, to love is to be an advocate, to accompany others, to stand beside others, to love others as Christ loved us. We see Jesus in the gospel, loving, advocating, accompanying the poor, the marginalized, women, persons with disabilities, lepers, strangers. He fed the hungry and healed the sick, and the list goes on and on. These are all a part of what he has now handed to his disciples and to us. It is the heart of who we are to be as Christians. We are to continue loving our neighbor and seeing them as God sees us all. And the Spirit is still moving among us and within us today as we continue Jesus' work of love. The more we love, the more we share, the more deeply we are connected to each other, to him, and to the one who sent him. I would suggest that this is the heart of the Christian journey. Or as Thomas Merton puts it, our job is to love others without stopping to inquire whether or not they are worthy. This love itself will render both ourselves and our neighbors worthy. Our own experience of salvation is tied deeply to the lives and the salvation of others. Just as love can change everything for the receiver, it also changes everything for the giver. And as we again and again engage in these acts of love, we are creating a muscle memory for our own hearts. Coming to a place at the end of our days where we are surprised, for those acts of love become not a hard act of will, but flow from us as effortlessly as a virtuoso's fingers fly over the strings of a violin. This is a bit of what we do here in the church. We practice loving. We practice standing with one another and standing for one another. through activities such as mission trips and youth conferences, through Sunday evening meals and volunteer work, through standing with one another in sorrow and difficulty, supporting one another, through working with each other on committees and making decisions together, and doing all of these things in a spirit of love, practicing and encouraging each other, standing together, and in the end, running together hand in hand toward the finish. Michael Linval, pastor of the First Presbyterian Church of Ann Arbor years ago, catches the spirit of that in a chapter in a delightful little book that I have of his, Good News from North Haven. It's actually about his experience before Ann Arbor in a small church in rural northern Minnesota. In a chapter about baptism, he tells about the time he found one of his members sitting alone, weeping in the sanctuary after baptism, which in this church traditionally involved the grandparents and the aunts and the uncles and everybody in that family group standing as the newest member of their family was held by the minister for the sacrament. Now, this woman's name was Mildred Corey, and through her tears, she told Michael that she had a new grandson and that she was thinking about his baptism. Michael told her to have her daughter Tina and Tina's husband give him a call, make arrangements. Well, Tina's got no husband, Mildred said. She's 18. She was confirmed in this church just a few short years ago. Well, she started seeing this older boy, and then Mildred hesitated and told the rest of the story. She had gotten pregnant, and the boyfriend had gone off and joined the Air Force, and Tina had decided to keep the baby, and she wants to have him baptized here in her church, but she's nervous to come and talk to you, Pastor, Mildred said. Now, at that time and in that place, Tina's situation would have raised eyebrows and was controversial enough that the session had a discussion about the appropriateness of the whole matter before approving it, which they did. The real problem, however, that everybody knew was that when the minister got to the part when the whole family, the grandmas and grandpas and the aunts and the uncles and the cousins, and were all supposed to stand up, there wasn't going to be any. And her situation would be out there for everyone to see. So the day arrived, and the church was full. An elder announced Tina Corey presents her son for baptism. Down the aisle she came nervously, Linval writes, shaking slightly with month-old Jimmy in her arms, a blue pacifier stuck in his mouth. The scene hurt all right, every bit as much as we knew it would. Who stands with this child? Michael asked. And Mildred, Tina's mother, stood up all by herself. Michael writes, I was just about to ask Tina the parents' questions when I became aware of movement in the pews. Well, Angus McDowell had stood up in his blue serge suit, Minnie beside him. Then a couple other elders stood up. Then the 6th grade Sunday school teacher stood up. Then a new young couple in the church stood up. And soon before my incredulous eyes, the whole church was standing up with Tina and with little Jimmy. I will not leave you orphaned, Jesus promised. I am coming to you. God's Spirit stands beside us. We stand with one another. We are not alone. Thanks be.